philosophical underpinnings of that. And so depending on who's in charge at the time, you may or may not feel that is the case. But what I would say is challenging in terms of in the society we have and in the political arena that we have, is living out those ideals in the policy landscape in some respects, because at the end of the day, as one of the other gentlemen said, you know, there's logic and there's policies, but a lot of what predicts voting patterns and support, you know, for one party or the other, one candidate or the other, has to do with emotions and communication and connection, you know, to those emotions, be it fear, be it passion, whatever it is. So in the legislature, you know, I served 4 terms in a legislature, and I was on the finance committee for 2, and one of the challenges was that my thought was that my responsibility was to, there as a legislator, was to uphold, you know, those ideals I had addressed earlier, but also to be sure that I was being a good steward of what are, you know, finite resources that the citizens contribute, and that what keeps everything running smoothly and in the best possible way for everyone. And so you would end up in these situations where it was just hard to do that, because through the political process, sometimes if I thought I was just being responsible, it would come across as being mean. Because it's much easier to say, I want to do this, I want to create this program, I want to give to this, give to that, you know, expand this, expand that. It's much easier to do that than to say, we have to be good stewards of this, we have to find efficiencies, we have to cut this, we have to move this. It's just more difficult. And so I think today, the interesting thing is that a lot of times, there's actually a lot of agreement in different areas that you wouldn't necessarily think. So what I think is interesting is that when you hear people promoting, for example, on the progressive side, if you will, they like to promote the idea of a, you know, utopia where everyone is equal and all of these things are put in place, you know, by the government or otherwise, where, you know, there's an equal playing field and everybody can be equal and there are no inequalities in society and etc. Now, does that mean that conservatives don't appreciate and want equality? No, it doesn't. It's just that I don't think I've never heard of such thing as a conservative utopia, because we believe that where there is freedom and opportunity, that if you try to manufacture inequality, what that does is suppress everybody, and it limits the freedom and opportunity of those that have the wherewithal, you know, be it through you know, whatever means they have, that they can climb out of that. So that's where we want freedom in education. We want freedom in the economy. And what's interesting is the last one I mentioned, free enterprise, has in fact, and I'm going to read something, has in fact been the most effective anti-poverty program, if you will, in the history of the world. There's a gentleman who is the president of, it's called the American Enterprise Institute, and he was a Democrat and then became a Republican, and this is why, and I'm just going to read this. He said that most Americans believe that poverty has gotten worse since we were children. If you ask Americans, has poverty gotten better or worse around the world, 70% will say that there's a hunger issue and it's gotten worse since the 1970s. But he said, here's an epiphany that I had. It changed my thinking. He said, from 1970 till today, the percentage of the world's population living in starvation, that percentage has declined by 80%. The greatest anti-poverty achievement in the history of mankind. And what did that? And he lays out 5 reasons. He says that 2 billion of our brothers and sisters have been pulled out of poverty since the 1970s through globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, and entrepreneurship. And those are all, of course, what we consider the free enterprise system. So looking at it now, when I look at, millennials that want to identify as independent, they don't really like what's going on in either party per se, but they really, really appreciate the integration and, access and power they have through technology and being able to summon whatever they want at whatever level of quality at whatever price as consumers in the global economy at the touch of their fingertips. This is through things like Priceline, Uber, Airbnb, all of these things. It's in fact the conservatives that support the enabling of that, and it's the progressives that seems to fight it. So that's very curious, but I think that if we allowed ourselves to not stereotype and not, quickly associate, okay, if you're a conservative, that means you're a Bible-thumping Trump supporter. Those two things don't even make sense anyway. But you wonder, how does that really happen? So I just think there's a lot of room for a lot of people that come from different areas and have come to their beliefs, through their own experience and their own perspective. And so, anyway, that's what I think about conservatism. And the last thing I'll say, and on that Bible-thumping note, I do think it's important. A lot of people, and I too, thought about this. How is it that conservatism and republicanism, if you will, is somehow associated with this, appreciation or, adherence to what we consider Judeo-Christian values? And to me, it's that if you look at it, in those terms, Christianity and the Judeo-Christian value system is the only one of the major world religions that thinks of humanity as sacred in such a way as being made in the image of God. In all of the other world religions, that either does not work in their paradigm or is considered a heresy. This is in Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, all of these. So I think that fed naturally into what are the foundational ideals in this country. Again, the individual liberty, the personal responsibility, the freedom to pursue happiness, as it were, and again, the respect for life and private property and all of these things. So that's where I think that connection came to. I don't think it manifests itself that clearly these days, but that's what makes sense to me. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I want to move to questions. We're having some technical difficulties, so I did write down 3 questions, but I would ask that you use the 3x5 cards or go to microphones. And I will start with the first question I wrote down, which I believe came from a student. What do you think prevents most millennials from being conservative?
Well, I teach them. And one, a lot of these kids have never been exposed in their education to a balanced presentation of what a conservative is that hasn't demonized them. But secondly, there's also, it's not surprising that people are more liberal or more flexible in terms of what life's possibilities are when they're younger. As Churchill put it, if you're not a socialist at 18, I wasn't, and I still don't have a heart, you don't have a heart. If you're still a socialist over 30, as Churchill put it, you may not have a brain. One of the reasons, and I think Donald Trump is so damaging to conservatives, and this is why I was for Marco Rubio. My daughters were for him, and the Republican message on things that millennials value and the tone in addition to the young being disposed to the liberal side, is very off-putting. If you have daughters, I have daughters and no sons, and you have a presidential candidate making disparaging reference to a conservative woman's menstrual cycle on national television, and you're behaving that way, and you're modeling for your daughters that this is an opportunity society, that's very difficult. And the other thing is, and I'll include Ted Cruz negatively in this, one of the things that Ronald Reagan had, and I think Marco Rubio had it, and that was very attractive to millennials, was that they were optimistic. They were forward-looking optimists who believed that our best days were ahead of us. And one of the things I point about this election cycle, sadly, is that if my hero Ronald Reagan were running in this election cycle, given his positive message, he would have lost, because this is a very angry time. Indeed, I think one of the ironies of this, when historians write about this, it's going to be called the Republican Party's suicide attempt. Obama has so goaded us to anger that instead of, let me finish. Instead of responding constructively to Obama's policies by offering a principled alternative, many Republicans have responded with blind, self-destructive rage that makes the institutionalization of everything they don't like much more likely. So it's even self-defeating. In a nutshell, I think that Republicans have inflicted a lot of this on ourselves by gravitating to an agenda of anger in candidates who express it, rather than embracing the what Madison calls the better angels of our nature, which was the personification of Rubio's and Reagan's forward-looking rather than gloom and doom root canal republicanism. So that's my answer in a nutshell.
Thank you. Let's take one more response, and then we'll move to another question.
Yeah, I think Bob's exactly right, that and confession is good for the soul. And so we Republicans need to repent, really, of the way that we have dealt with Barack Obama. And I'll give you a very concrete example. In the 10 race, I was in trouble, had 4 couples that in previous cycles had given me thousands of dollars. They were giving me 0 in that cycle. So we got together, I'm embarrassed to say, at a Presbyterian church that was helped us start another Presbyterian church. And so we met at this church building on a Tuesday night. And after an hour and a half of trying to talk them back onto the team, one of them spoke for the rest of them, said, "Bob, what don't you get? Barack Obama is a communist Marxist who wants to destroy the American economy so he can take over as dictator. Healthcare is part of that," and it's not finished. Healthcare is part of that, and he wants to open up the Mexican border and turn us into a Muslim nation. Because I don't know if you knew it, don't tell the Pope, but he thinks they're all Catholics. But anyway, next week I saw John Boehner on the floor of the House, and I said, "Boehner, you're a much better politician than me. Tell me what you would have said." And he said, "Well, I would have told him it's not that bad." And I said, "John, that didn't work. I tried it. Let me tell you," and I said, "Let me give you some advice. If you're going to try to lead these people where they're already going, you're going to have to say over your shoulder, you don't know the half of it. If you knew the Barack Obama I knew, you'd really be afraid." And that is what a lot of Republicans chose to do. You don't know the half of it. And so I think Bob's exactly right. We have deserved this. And so now what we need to do is say, that's not what conservatism is. In my view, conservatism is much more one of my heroes, Jack Kemp, who, by the way, all of that about Barack Obama just then, and sadly in that church that night, could have been summarized with, there is a black man in the White House. And so, but Jack Kemp was this guy who they used to say had showered with more black people than most white people know. because Jack Kemp, as you recall, was a professional football player. And Jack Kemp believed that the test of conservatism is it works for everyone. That is the test that we must accept if we're going to rebuild a conservative movement.
Thank you. I want to move to a student question at the microphone.
Uh-oh.
My question, is the microphone on? Okay.
Talk loud.
Well, my question, I see this as a development that was happening throughout the Obama era, even before the Trump phenomenon, is that the Republican Party seems to be looking more for intellectuals who reinforce their beliefs and not intellectuals who challenge it. And I think climate change is a perfect example. I think what's happened with the Heritage Foundation is another example. And so my question to you is, how can you rekindle the Friedmanite, intellectually honest Republican Party that we had years ago?
Read my new book, The Dangerous Doctrine of Barack Obama. Mike, actually, with the Heritage Foundation, that should be your question.
Well, the question is, the dynamics we're talking about now predate Trump and predate even Obama's time, and it reflects a broader, if I get this right, polarization where each side, or at least the side on the right, I would argue both sides, seek out validation by looking at only certain intellectuals but not others. And they get into, I guess, intellectual silos and don't find ways to get out of that. One thing I would just say at the outset is I think in the counter to what Bob said earlier about millennials is that not only do they not hear balanced presentations of conservative ideas and from renowned conservative thought leaders over the time, but when they're given ideas coming out of the left, they're given them as if they're easily done. You know, you can make everything free. You can, whether it's college, whether it's healthcare, whether it's whatever, you can do this, and it's going to be no cost. It's going to be a simple legislative fix, and they're led to believe that. And there's no counter. There's no one saying, "Wait a minute, what about this consideration or that consideration?" And they come in for a surprise, and they will when they get out of the campus and into the real world. But I think the point is good, and there's been a lot of work done with respect to political polarization and how it's been exacerbated over time. I think when you look at those numbers I cited, the fact that the share of Republicans who say they're conservative has gone from 42 to 70 in the last 40 years says something. And the share of Democrats who are liberal, they've sorted themselves more into the Democratic camp. And it's obvious when you look at the body politic, there was a time when there was quite a bit of overlap in voting records by party. So there was this middle that I've cited this in past sessions, so bear with me. But basically, there used to be an enormous number of both senators and House members who were in between the most liberal Republican and conservative Democrat. And as of about 2010, and Congressman Inglis can verify this, I think, too, that number had diminished down to single digits in the House and 0 in the Senate, to the point where you have these two ideological tribes that each are part of each party. And so that changes some of the dynamic as well. It changes how advocacy groups on the outside interact, because most times now, if you're a left-of-center advocacy group, you don't have much sway in the conservative members' districts and vice versa. Heritage has an advocacy arm now, and it really has no capacity to go into a Democratic district and change anybody's mind. So they focus on Republicans, and there's all this intramural Republican stuff that goes on in that regard. So you're right, and I'm not sure what the solution is. I think it would be nice if there was more, one of my heroes is William Buckley, and at Hoover, the Hoover Institution where I work now has the library and archives have all of the firing line episodes. And if you go, we've done some episodes, some events in DC now, mainly for young people, to show them examples of how he treated issues that are of current, like how he dealt with terrorism in interviews, or early stages of the internet and privacy, or immigration, things that are still hot issues. And the young students today, my interns and the other students who come in for these events, are shocked that you could have had serious intellectual discourse without yelling, without personal attacks, without kind of false innuendos, and have an actual discussion. And there's not a lot of that left anymore, and to the extent someone tries to do it, I don't think they get high ratings, unfortunately. You know?
There is some of it. I would commend to you, go online and look at an interview that Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard did a couple of hours with Larry Summers, the president of Harvard. And Kristol's a neoconservative and Summers is a liberal, and they had a very sophisticated, deep, civil, profound discussion about the implications of political correctness on campus that didn't fit into normal categories. You can find that information. That's one of the blessings of the internet age, but one of the problems is you don't get it systematically, including American universities where, let me be honest, you have conservatives on this campus once a year, every April, for a week. We're treated nicely, but when it comes to diversity, this is one of the reasons all of you here, believe it or not, should worry if the Republican Party implodes. All of us here on the conservative side should worry if the Democratic Party implodes, because whenever it's a one-party system and you're not accountable to a coherent opposition and there isn't transparency, this is where the Judeo-Christian side says absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's not healthy for the country if we don't have two principled, informed parties.
I want to move to, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions that came in previously, then I will come to this side for Mary Linda. Two questions coming at the same issue. Can a humanist or atheist be a conservative? And can you be a conservative without being religious?
Yeah, I think you definitely can. In what I was explaining about maybe kind of the genesis of conservatism, that's where I think it came from in terms of that respect and appreciation, again, from things that are inherently Judeo-Christian values. But in the application of those conservative ideals today, again, I would just say look at what you appreciate and think is beneficial to your life and creates a better future for you and your children. If that's good education, if that's access to quality health care, if that's the opportunity to make the most of the free market system in terms of ease of starting a business, being able to access services and products and goods and all of these things. Again, I think conservatism and those ideals as applied through the political apparatus and rule of law and all of that we have today, I think those are the ones that support free enterprise, which again I think is one of the most important and beneficial things for all of humanity, and particularly, of course, citizens here in the country. So you don't have to agree with everything. I think everyone looks for in a political party or candidate someone that represents their thoughts and beliefs and ideals perfectly, but the fact is, and then it is very angry when someone's a traitor because they thought differently about something. But in fact, I don't remember who said it, but someone said the only person you'll agree with 100% of the time is yourself, and that's true. So I think there's a lot of things to appreciate within conservatism, and again how that's applied through our political process that leaves a lot of room for a lot of people.
Thank you.
So my question is, like Mr. Kaufman pointed out, one of the tenets for a rekindled conservative movement would be the fact that the U.S. remains a key geopolitical player across the world. But with the rise of other countries like China and non-state actors like the European Union, we see that the United States is no longer the singular power. We live in a multipolar society. So my question is, how can the United States maintain its role of being a key geopolitical player due to the fact that we're losing soft power and influence in many ways?
We have a couple of questions embedded there, but first of all, it's not a self-evident proposition that we are in decline. To quote Charles Krauthammer, it's a choice. And also, I commend you Joe Joffe's new book. China is much weaker than it appears. And China is reaching really a critical point, and it will, and this is one of the reasons I am so concerned about the diminution of American power, because one of the things that convinced Gorbachev to give up rather than expand when he faced his dilemma was he faced Ronald Reagan and a rejuvenated America and a robust deterrent. Chinese are going to head to that same crossroads, that sooner or later, and we're seeing some of the beginnings of it, you can't reconcile the monopoly of the Communist Party in China with economic dynamism. And historically, when empires have faced that dilemma, they have sometimes, when they have perceived weakness, focused on expansion. Think of the Japanese in 1941. What the United States needs to do is have in place a robust, credible democratic alliance system so that when the Chinese reach the Gorbachev moment, as they will, they make Gorbachev's decision rather than the imperial Japanese decision. And I fear the last 8 years under President Obama, which is the theme of my new book, is tilting the probabilities in exactly the other direction. So while I think your concern is a valid one, I don't quite share the underlying premise of the inevitability. I think we've made decline a choice, and I think that's extremely dangerous.
Thank you. I'll toss this one out. What do you dislike about Kasich? Doesn't he have the best chance in the general election? Let's go at the far end of the table.
Go ahead. Can't stand him.
What do I like about John Kasich? John's my friend. I served with him on the budget committee for 6 years, so he was the chairman. He rightly gets credit for balancing the budget. That was largely driven by John's force of personality. The thing that's true about John, like every politician, is we're all a little bit egocentric, but I think in John's case it's not pathological. Some of us, it is pathological, you know, the egocentrism. So, but now, let me give you a story that will show you just how impressive John is. And goes to this repenting thing I was talking about and how we've got to remake this energy in Solutionville and get away from the crazy comments on the far left and the far right that are unhinged and unconnected to reality. So in about 94 or 5, I guess, John Kasich was hosting a dinner for the budgeteers at Jim Colby's house, a member of Congress from Arizona. And John was at the head of the table, and there's a guy sitting closer to him, another budget committee member, and then there was me. And this other budget committee member was telling John all of the terrible things that were being said about Hillary Clinton on talk radio. You remember there was some awful stuff said about her on talk radio. Now, mind you, I'm not here as a fan of Hillary Clinton, I understand, but anyway, so this guy is saying all these things about Hillary. I won't repeat them here because they're so scurrilous. And so I'm sitting there to my embarrassment and humiliation now, sort of in body language. Yeah, John, what do you think about that? John looks at the two of us and he says, why would you say that about her? She is a brilliant and beautiful woman. Why would you say that about her? And for me, it was quite the thanks. I needed that. Only people enough in the audience to remember that commercial on television will understand what I just did. It's a shaving cream commercial. So that, to me, is a great indication of the way that John Kasich is willing to say, let's deal with, we're looking for solutions here. Let's not demonize the other side. And let's bring America together. And you know what? Conservatives have a lot more to offer than rage. And so conservatism has a lot more to offer than just branding the other side as some kind of Satan incarnate. And so John is an impressive fellow in all those ways.
Thank you.
Every year, every 4 years, liberals choose a darling of the Republican Party that they'd like to be nominated because they're really not conservative, and you like them because they're not. Last time it was John Huntsman. The flavor of the week this year in 2016 is John Kasich. I don't think he's a deeply principled conservative, but even if you thought he was, and I don't, he has less charisma than I do. He has absolutely no chance of getting the nomination. He is the avoidance of reality. And in many ways, he's actually furthering Donald Trump's cause by staying in a race that he has no chance of winning. I'm going to make a prediction because I don't think John Kasich is firmly conservative. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump got the nomination if John Kasich would accept the vice presidency. That, in a nutshell, for me, that suspicion for me, is why, although if it were John Kasich alone, I would really hold my nose and vote for Kasich. He is not a viable or a desirable option for the conditions we face in 2016, period. No ands, ifs, or buts. He's not plausible.
Thank you.
Can I just challenge that? I think to say that John Kasich is not conservative is just nonsense. And it's
No,
just
it
absolute nonsense.
No, it isn't.
The only thing that you could point to, Bob, would possibly be the Medicaid expansion.
He's
But
a
then-
mushy multilateralist internationally. He
is
believes that NATO
No,
can
and-
substitute for American power. He is not reliable on Israel or the Middle East.
Oh my goodness.
He's not reliable on a lot of these things. And he will not win the support of conservative voters. Look, he's taken one state. He's not going to take any place else. If you want to stop Trump, you have to choose the plausible alternative, and Kasich takes away from Cruz's vote.
Mary
A
Linda
vote
would
for
like to weigh
Kasich
in.
is a vote for Trump, period.
Yeah, I actually don't have a strong opinion on this. I just wanted to say that in answering the question, what do I like and dislike? I like the fact that I think, he has been one to contribute a lot to things that I think are positive and beneficial for the country and Congress, and then on behalf of his state as the governor of Ohio. So I like and appreciate that. What I dislike is I'm never quite sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And secondly, I wish he had never been in the race because he wasn't who I supported. So.
Thank you. This Broncos student here has been very patient. Please.
Is this working? Okay. It is working. Okay. So it was said earlier that Trump supporters are not actually the conservatives. They don't really embody the true liberal, or the true conservative ideals. And yet, I'm sure if we interviewed many of the Trump supporters, they would identify themselves as Republicans and conservatives. So what do you think happened in the last couple of years that drove these Trump supporters to support such an extreme candidate for the election?
Okay, that's not true. That's just not true. Most people who identify themselves strongly as conservatives have not voted for Trump. Trump is bringing in a different demographic to the Republican Party. Now, I think your question reframed about conservatives is a good one. What is it about the Republican primary electorate that makes Trump a possibility? I think that's a very good question, and I think anger and blind rage has a lot to do with it. But what I would respond to you is don't conflate the two issues, Trump and conservatism. In many ways, if you look at those most opposed to Trump, in terms of voting and the candidates, it's the conservatives, for better or worse, where Trump is doing least well. What Republicans have to answer and what conservatives like me have to answer is, let me be honest, how has Donald Trump potentially hijacked the Republican Party of Reagan from us? And I think your question, stripped away from identifying Trump as a conservative phenomenon, is an excellent one. And we have a lot of soul searching to do about that, because this is very damaging not only for this election cycle, but if Trump gets the nomination, for several yet to come.
Let's hear from Michael.
A couple of points to get to the final answer. One is that I think the predicate to Trump, the pre-Trump couple 4 or 5 years, saw a lot of conservatives and a lot of conservative organizations push a message that if you just control the House of Representatives, you can repeal Obamacare, you can disable Dodd-Frank, you can do all these wonderful things. Which was, if you try to understand the Constitution, the Constitution was designed not to allow that to happen. The Constitution was meant to be something that it was hard to get things done. The powers are divided in various and sundry ways, as we all know. And then the part of the message too was, if these things don't happen, if Obamacare goes into effect in 2014, it's because the elites and the establishment wanted that to happen. So the anger in part was that all these people it's a charade, and all these things that are happening that we don't like are being done sort of in a conscious but under the table way, and that fueled a lot of the anger. And initially, I think Cruz thought he would be the one to lead that charge and be the messenger for all that anger, but instead this guy emerges out of the swamps, and otherwise known as Queens, right? And decides he's the vehicle for all that frustration. And he's telling them, if we don't stop immigration that we don't like tomorrow, it's because the establishment doesn't want it. All these different things he lays out there. And the talk show hosts were echoing that. And it created this, I think, this false sense of what was possible, A, and B, what explains their frustrations. And then he's channeling that. And hopefully at this point, he's imploded enough that things can right themselves again a little bit, but it's been an ugly few years in that regard. And a lot of it was based upon constitutional ignorance, frankly, to try to sell the idea that this is possible. And then the Senate goes Republican in 2012, 2014, and all of a sudden, now we can get all these things done. And you need the supermajority. The Senate has a long tradition of needing consensus and so on. And there weren't enough Republicans to do that on their own, like there was in 2009 and 10. So it's a very, very, I think, kind of the level of education could be higher, and it might have sorted people into more rational camps if that had happened.
Let's get one more question.
I'm gonna try to stand on my tiptoes here. So if you look at statistics from the United States Census Bureau, voter efficacy is a major problem, with only 60% voting in presidential elections and 40% voting in non-presidential elections. So how can the Republican Party tap into the non-voters as well as liberals on the other side of the spectrum in order to have a more of a pull factor for the Republican Party? What major pull factor do we have as a Republican Party?
You have 1 minute, Mary Linda.
Okay. Well, this isn't the answer that I want necessarily, but I think oddly enough, what we've seen is Donald Trump has somehow managed to pull people out of the woodwork that have never voted before. And it's kind of like, now you're starting? But anyway, then to go back to the other person's question, I think there's this idea that's promoted and aggressively by those whose purposes it serves, that Donald Trump is the current or awaited embodiment and expression of everything that Republicans and conservatives have ever wanted, when in fact it's completely the opposite. In fact, had he, kind of never entered the sphere, and let's say 2 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever, if you asked any of the conservatives that I know, that I've served with, that are the, high information, strict constitutionalists, the people that know what eminent domain even means, that kind of thing, and, described this candidate, Donald Trump, and these are the things he supports and what he says, none of them would ever support him. I think he's just a symptom of whatever it is that has happened, in this country in the last, I'll say, 8 years. A lot of people want to say, well, you can't blame Obama for everything, or we do blame Obama for everything. But if those people really believe that Trump is some sort of magician that has so effectively, contorted and rewired everyone's brain that everyone suddenly has turned into this base, instinctual animal that's, racist and this and that. No way. There's just no way he could have done that. I think it's just what has occurred through what's been the political environment in the last 7 years, and I think a lot of that is polarization and is this sort of bullying and elitism and professional political class attitude and all of that. So that hopefully answers your question.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. Thank you for attending the session. Don't forget to text LEAVE into your phone. Next session begins in 10 minutes.
At some point, I want to pick your brain if you're in DC. You started doing